One of the, if not the most important handcraft in human history is spinning yarn, or textile production in general. As early as the people started producing crops, farming crops and growing their own food, there were only three main things the people did with their hands: crafting tools for the field production, building huts to dwell in, and producing textiles to wear. And the spinning of a yarn, the creation of a yarn out of a fiber, was one of the most important and most essential everyday life activity for every household and mostly every woman, all the way from more than 8,000 years ago all the way to the early industrial times. And I now want to show you how it was done. All that they needed for it was a spindle and a piece of fabric. This is wool from a sheep. They probably started back then 8,000 years ago with fabrics from plants, and probably started by creating ropes out of these fabrics, and then at one time came up with the idea of creating smaller ropes and even smaller ropes of even finer fibers, and then creating textiles and fabrics out of these kind of small ropes called yarn. How you start this whole procedure is by taking a little bit of this fabric. It is easy to do if you already stretch it out like this, so that all the fibers kind of have one direction to go. It is a good way to start with putting on a piece of cloth that has a rough surface like this kilt. So a modern pants or modern fabric in general that's all smooth will not work, because what we're going to do, we're going to take a small bit of this fiber, pull it out in the thickness we wanted, and then we're just going to spin it, twirl it into a beginning of a yarn. It doesn't need to be perfect at this point, because this is just our point to start. I'm not that good at spinning, I've just done it a few times, but the technique is one that you learn, and then you can just do it. You're going to be a lot better with it, but the craft is an easy to learn, hard to master. You have to be careful to put just as many new fibers out of here as you need for the thickness of your yarn, and not too many fibers, but not too few, because otherwise the yarn will be too thin and will rip apart. If you have around this much of a yarn, you can take your spindle again, and you now have to attach the yarn, the beginning and the bottom of your spindle. The spindle is designed with a body of mass at the bottom, so when you spin the spindle to spin the yarn, to create this motion that we've created with the by rubbing the fibers on our leg, we've created a spinning motion and twirled the fibers within on themselves to make them stiff, to make them withstanding force. I can already put quite some force to this yarn, although it is not spun that well. And this body of mass at the bottom of the spindle will allow the force you give to the spindle to continue spinning it as it hangs freely, and then it will create some yarn for you. So I'm just gonna make a knot at the bottom, twirl it out a little bit. Spindles have a small notch at the top, I hope you can see that. There is where we're gonna create a small sling with the yarn we have. We're just gonna create a small sling, put it around here, and it should hold. So now we have got our yarn on our spindle. And now we're able to spin the whole thing, create this spinning motion, as you can see. You have, of course, to consider in which way your yarn is drilled by the motion you've done on your leg. So this should be clockwise, so we are spinning this spindle clockwise. Now you have to create the same thing over again. Pull out some fibers here, spin the whole thing, and pull out some fibers again, and give, oops, don't let your fibers get entangled with your yarn. That was a mess. Take it up here on your hand, or just in your hand, and then it will work. True masters will be able to let the spindle hang freely in the air while they're giving new fibers to it, to the yarn, as they work. But that takes a lot of experience, and the hard part in this is not really to make a constant yarn. At the beginning, that's of course also very hard, but the hardest part in this is to make it evenly thick, to not have thicker and thinner parts, because you can imagine in a fabric, in a part of clothing especially, having yarn and yarn of different sizes will make quite the difference in how the fabric will feel on the skin. One of the most common mistakes is that you're giving the drill too high up into your wool, giving it too many fibers, and once the drill is, for example, up here inside of the wool, it's very hard to give it all the way. You can see that this is far too many fibers, it's far thicker. What you'd normally want for a yarn this thick would be like this many fibers. You can see that they already drilled in, and then when I give the spindle another hit, they will continue to spin and create a smooth yarn. But if I now give the drill too high up, you can see that as I am unaware and don't pay much attention to this drill's very high up, it can barely be undone here. So it's a lot of effort to take all the fibers out of there again, and that's something that you should be careful not to do. When you have a yarn of a decent size, decent length, then you can just loosen up the small knot here, take it out, and just spin it around your spindle. And you have to imagine that, as I said, they probably started with plant-based fibers. It's very hard in an archaeological sense to really find out what they started with, what they did, because fibers, as you can imagine, rot very easily, especially wool and plant fibers. Of course, not on modern plastic fibers, but the ancients didn't have plastic, so their fibers rot away very easily. And so we can assume that they started with plant-based fibers, since we find spindles and spindle weights in villages that did not have sheep yet, or woolly sheep that we knew today started to be domesticated around 6000 BC or 5000 BC, around that range. Still, even before this sheep existed and the wild sheep didn't really have any fibers that one can use for wool production, even before that sheep existed that you could use for actual wool production, they did use spindles, and they therefore also probably created yarn, because there's not much other use for a spindle. So we have to assume that they started with plant-based fibers. And the way we can identify spindles is, of course, not by wooden ones, because they rot just as easily as the textiles that you are producing with it. But what we actually find are these spindles, clay spindles, with a small part of pottery on the top or on the bottom, to create the mass that then spins the whole thing. This is probably a piece that you would see, that you also would have seen 6 or 7, 8,000 years ago in the Near East, in the Fertile Crescent, where most of the domesticated and Neolithic history takes place, and where one could say all civilization started with the first farmers coming out of that area. This is linen, and you can see that it is rather fine, but I'm also not that good at spinning, so it is not as fine as it could be. In comparison, this is how my linen looks, and this is modern linen fabric. You can really see the difference in thickness and evenness in the two. And even though it does maybe not look as complicated here in the video, it probably takes months of practice to create an evenly thin and smooth and comfy piece of yarn to then create textile with. And it also takes up so much of your time to spin a yarn. And even though it's very hard to reconstruct, because of course today nobody spins like this anymore, some researchers tackled the topic and came up with numbers that suggest hundreds of hours for even the smallest piece of fabric. And you have to imagine that all of humans' clothing, all of mankind's clothing in the last 8,000 years, at least until the creation of the spinning wheel in the late medieval times, so just 600 or 700 years ago, this was the technique that was used. It was the everyday life for every person for over 7,000 years to have clothing spun and woven out of with this kind of techniques. And it really takes ages to create a fabric. And then when your yarn rips apart, it takes ages to reconnect that. It's really a pain in the ass. And this, of course, was an everyday activity for probably every single woman, or at least most of them, in the historical and prehistorical times. You can, one can say that probably every girl of a farmer in a farming stead learned how to spin from their mother, even at the youngest age. And they continued to do so, as I said, until the production of the spinning wheel, but also in the more outer regions of Europe, in the, for example, in northern Scandinavia, in parts of Russia, and some parts of the Iberian Peninsula, also Spain and Portugal. The people even did this in the 18th, 19th century, and worked with this kind of yarn at their farmsteads. You can then further on create beautiful fabrics with your yarn. There are a few home techniques that you can make small, simple fabrics with a simple piece of yarn, but I will not cover that in this video, but I will link a video in which you can produce beautiful small fabrics like this in a simple pattern with a weaving technique that's very common and also historically used in large parts of Europe and the whole world. And yeah, this is a test piece that I've done. It's very simple to do, very easy to understand, and a very good video that I will link. So this was a small video all about the spinning, the craft of spinning, and with some historical background. If you enjoy this kind of small videos with a little bit of historical background and introducing a historical handcraft, then leave a comment in the comment section stating so. And if you don't, please also, because I need your feedback on what kind of videos you want to see, and then which I can make. For comparison with the other yarn that I've spun, I will also show you this. This is the first kind of woolen yarn that I've spun, it took several hours to make this bunch, and you can see how thick and uneven and ugly this yarn went out. And this is just the outer parts, so the stuff that I did later on, not the earlier parts that's inside, and it's really not beautiful. You wouldn't want a sweater out of that wool. So yeah, it takes a lot of practice to even get the yarn as thin as I made them now in the video. Yes, so yeah, leave me a comment, and if you're interested in this kind of content, and I'm glad that you watched this video to the end. Have a nice day, and goodbye.